Everyone needs to have at least 2 cars because one of them needs to be a ragtop, and a ragtop doesn't always make it. But for little outings like this, driving around town and looking at things and chasing down old railroads and whatnot, nothing beats a convertible. Think of it like having 2 Hawaiian shirts, one with flames on it and the other with, orchids on it. You really need both. I mean, there's no way that you can say, well, one Hawaiian shirt is going to cover everything. It's going to be appropriate for all situations. No, it just simply isn't. Flames, well, that's a whole statement. Orchids, that's a totally different statement. So you really need to have both. And the same holds true with having one hardtop, at least one hardtop, and at least one convertible. Well, this morning we're off trying something a little bit different. There's a hobby out there called ghost tracking railroads. The concept behind ghost tracking a railroad is you go find a railroad that no longer exists and you try to figure out where it ran. And maybe you can find some of the old grade and possibly some of the structures that existed along the railroad and that sort of thing. If you're out in the boondocks, this can be fairly easy to do because the grades are still there. Sometimes water tanks are still there. Sometimes bridges are still there. You're never quite sure what you might actually find. In this particular case, we're going to try doing the impossible, a bit of urban archaeology. We're going to try ghost tracking a series of railroads that existed right here in the Salt Lake City Valley that have been utterly absorbed into the urban landscape. But if you know exactly where to look, and I do, then you can find these subtle little artifacts of where these railroads used to be. Now currently we're pulling up on the transportation hub for UTA. This is where the front runner, the interurban railroad, runs all the way from Provo to Ogden up and down the Wasatch Front, connects with the light rail system and trolley system that runs up through Sugar House. Now this particular facility right here happens to be exactly where the train station for 3 different railroads that were built by one of Brigham Young's sons was located. And this became the central hub for those 3 railroads and where they connected with the Denver and Rio Grande, the Rio Grande Western that went to Denver. It was originally built as a 3-foot gauge railroad, and then shortly after it got to Salt Lake, it was turned into a standard gauge railroad. But the railroads that were built here by Young were all 3-foot gauge railroads, and they interchanged with the 3-foot Rio Grande in a train station that stood right over there, right here on the same piece of property as the current transit center. So kind of interesting how sometimes the geography plays in a certain sort of way, and things that were end up being back again 100 years later in the exact same location because the location still makes sense. Now right in front of me is an old building that has been taken over by the Utah Transit Authority, and this was the roundhouse and shops for the Denver and Rio Grande, and the building is still there. And in fact, if you look very closely on the south end, you can still see roundhouse stalls there. They're not being used as roundhouse stalls anymore, but they're still there, and you can spot them if you know what to look for. So the 3-foot gauge line of Young's railroads ran right along here, paralleling what was back then the Denver and Rio Grande Western main line, right over there, where it still is, as a matter of fact, and currently being used by the front runner trains. And this brings us to our first major stop along Young's railroads, the Portland Cement Company. This cement plant was built by Thomas Edison, of all people, who in the waning days of his life decided that the entire world should be built out of concrete. He came out with a whole line of concrete houses and concrete products. He even came up with a concrete phonograph, since he was into phonographs. These things were made of cement/concrete, various forms of Portland cement, which was another one of his inventions, Portland cement. and it was being manufactured in plants all over the country, including this beast right behind us, the Portland Cement Company of Utah. So right after the Portland cement plant back there, the train made a nice sweeping bend to the east and came right up the middle of this street. This is 8th South. Now back then this was not as commercial as it is now. It was mostly little farms, fruit orchards and that sort of thing coming up through here. But the train went right up the middle of 8th South all the way to 700 East. And at 7th East, it made a right turn to the next street over, which is 9th South. And then at 9th South, it made a bend and it went up the middle of 9th South. And it continued up 9th South to 9th East, which is a very, very hip little community now, the 9th and 9th community. And there it split, and the one line went up to Fort Douglas. That was the Salt Lake and Fort Douglas line. It went up to Fort Douglas, Red Butte Canyon, and Dry Canyon. The other line, the one that bent off to the south, eventually went all the way to Park City. But it went up to Sugar House, and then John Young, the builder of these railroads, took over the sugar mill at Sugar House, which was never really a sugar mill. I mean, they called it a sugar mill, but it never actually worked. It was designed by my great-great-grandfather, and he was always a little upset about that, but it never actually worked. And they made molasses there. That was the closest thing they could come to making sugar. And then when that didn't work out very well, they made paper there. And then the granite mill opened, the paper mill called the Granite Mill, and that sort of put that business out of business. And so John Young took the building over and used it as a locomotive shop for the little trains that went up through here. Since this is such a hip neighborhood, I decided to stop and get a very hip burrito salad here at Barbacoa. Barbacoa is in an old building, the only building that was actually here when the railroad came through. It's now called the Woodman Building, and the structure you see behind me is in front that was added on, but the back half is an old mill that was here that was probably built in about 1870, and the 3/4 gauge trains went right up through here, and they had a siding that backed in along the east side of the building here. If you're ever in Salt Lake, do stop here at Barbacoa and have one of these burrito salads. They're really quite excellent. Well, that's it for Chapter 1. In Chapter 2, we're going to continue following the Salt Lake and Fort Douglas as it breaks off from here to the north and goes up to Fort Douglas, Dry Canyon, Red Butte Canyon, and Wagner's Brewery. In Chapter 3, we'll follow the line that breaks off to the south, to Salt Lake and Eastern, to Winter Sugar House, and ultimately to Park City. So look for those on the YouTube channel, subscribe to the YouTube channel, subscribe on Vimeo, like me on Facebook, all of those goofy things that we want to do. I don't know how you found me on the internet, but I hope you didn't find me too boring, and I'll see you here again soon.